everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're continuing our first unit here in American history. Yesterday we talked about the Boston Massacre and the tensions rising between the colonists and the British over taxes and the colonists feeling like, they're being micromanaged and they want to be, left alone. Today we're going to pick up right where we left off and we're going to start talking about the growing divide between the colonists and the British, and it's going to lead up to the Declaration of Independence today. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So after the Boston Massacre, there very much starts being this idea of us versus them. So much so, there's something that gets created in 1772 called the Committees of Correspondence. Now, the Committees of Correspondence sounds kind of not important, but in actuality, it is very symbolic of the growing divide between the colonists, they're not the United States yet, the colonists and Britain, all right? So what the Committee of Correspondence is just a group of people that communicated with each other. They corresponded with each other. That doesn't seem like that big of a deal until you realize they are corresponding with each other about troop movements from Britain, like the Redcoats. It's a group of colonists that are spying on the Redcoats because after the Boston Massacre, tensions have risen here in the colonies. So England is sending over more Redcoats to keep the peace. Well, the colonists respond to this by creating this thing called the Committees of Correspondence, which is super illegal. This is like treason, more or less. They're basically start communicating with the colonists, with themselves, completely cutting Britain out of the equation. A lot of what they're doing is talking about troop movements, where the Redcoats are, how many are there. This is, in modern day, would be like Americans spying on American troops secretly and not letting the United States government know about it. So at the time, the Committees of Correspondence, the fact that they are actively spying on the Redcoats, is a very large sign that there is a divide mentally between the colonists and the British, because instead of viewing the Redcoats as their army, it's the enemy invading military almost. By this point, people are having to get pressured into picking a side. If you support the colonists, and this gradual move, because this idea of independence, being separate from Britain, starts getting thrown out at the time. If you support that, you would be called a patriot. If you're like, guys, I know we have beef with England, but if we can hug it out and come to an agreement and be better for everybody else, I think we should still remain part of the British Empire, you would be called a loyalist. So this is a little cartoon here. So if you're like, we love King George, who is the King of England at the time, you would be considered a loyalist. If you were like, no, let's be completely independent, let's worry about ourselves, then you would be considered a patriot. Since we all know we're our own country now of America and that we're going to fight England and we're going to win and get our independence, it's real easy to imagine that we would all be patriots, like if we were back then. It was about equal amounts. About 20% of the country were patriots. About 20% of the country were loyalists. And about 60% didn't care. All right, we'll get to that in a minute. But about 60% didn't care. They're like, why does this matter? We're just going to, have to pay taxes to somebody. So again, while the story focuses on loyalists and patriots, and a lot of the patriots here in a survey course on U.S. history, understand that a lot of the country just didn't care yet. Obviously, Boston, the high populated areas did, but a lot of the rural areas did not really care one way or other whether America was going to be, the colonists were going to be an independent country or not. Not yet. We're going to get to that here in this lesson. So the question here is, explain how the Committees of Correspondence showed a further break from England, mentally, and how it symbolizes a growing us versus them mentality among the colonists. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right. So again, tensions are already high. something happens in 1773 that further escalates tensions. It's an act of rebellion or vandalism, depending on how you want to look at it. In 1773, England, still needing a bunch of money, if you remember from our last lesson, they had saved the colonies from English-French rule in the French and Indian War. And they're forcing the colonists to pay back all the money they spent saving the colonists. They did this by increasing a bunch of taxes and putting taxes on a bunch of stuff that the colonists were unhappy about. It wasn't, again, the colonists aren't angry about taxes. They know they have to pay taxes. The colonists are upset that they don't have any say-so in these taxes. All right? They don't have any representation. It's a huge sticking point for the colonists. So in 1773, England creates a tax and puts it on tea, and it's called the Tea Act. Very original. Colonists drank tea. This is still very common in England today. Hot tea, kind of like coffee, very similar. America is actually going to eventually make a transition from tea being a culture here in America to coffee. England is going to put a tax on tea. The problem with this tax on tea is it was allowed to be given to one specific group. This group that was the British East India Company. They have a monopoly on tea. They're allowed to charge whatever they want for tea. The fact that the price of tea skyrocketed infuriated the colonists. It's just a spite because, again, if everybody in the British Empire was paying these same super high and super ridiculous prices on tea, the colonists probably would have dealt with it. But the colonists are the only ones paying this high price of tea because Britain thinks the colonists should be the sole bearers of this debt from the French and Indian War. And the colonists don't like that. They don't have any say-so over it. So the tax is more disrespectful than anything else. And that's what the colonists don't like, is this disrespect of these taxes. So the colonists responded to this by doing something pretty ridiculous. All right, it is very famous in American history. It's going to be called the Boston Tea Party. So what happens? And again, this is Boston, same place the Boston Massacre took place at. Very large population of patriots. A ship shows up in Boston now, and it's filled with tea. The British East India Company sent in a big shipment of tea and tea leaves, all right? And it's on this boat in the Boston harbor. This tea is going to be spread throughout the entire colony. So this is millions of dollars of tea sitting on this boat. The colonists, especially in Boston, are very upset knowing that this tea is going to be sold at an exorbitant marked up price, and the taxes are going to be very high on it, which makes them feel disrespected because they had no say-so in these taxes. So the colonists here in Boston refused to let the ship be unloaded. All right, it just sits here in the harbor, and they won't let it get unloaded because, again, they know this has taxes on this cargo that they don't like. So it's kind of forced to just sit here, and everybody's at a standstill. England doesn't really know how to respond to this. The colonists are like, I don't really know how we move forward here, but we're not letting this dang, overpriced tea come off the ships. All right. So what happens is one night, a group of guys are at the bar getting drunk. The amount of stories in American history that start with that, especially in colonial times, is very high. This is kind of how the Boston Massacre got started, is drunk people going out and harassing the redcoats. A group of drunk guys in Boston, or I guess they're sitting there at night and they're seeing this empty ship sit in the harbor, and they decide, let's go destroy all the tea. All right, we'll end it right now. We'll go out here and we'll destroy all the tea. Granted, they wanted tea, but the disrespect of being forced to pay these high taxes on the tea mattered more to them than actually getting the tea itself. So they get together and they go out to throw all this tea off the boat, because when tea leaves hit salt water, it destroys the tea leaves. You can't scoop it out of the ocean and then still use it. Somebody's like, wait a minute, Billy. What if they recognize us? And because they've all been drinking, somebody's like, you know what we should do? we should all dress up like Indians. And they're like, that's a fantastic idea, Jethro. And all these drunk colonists, they dress up like Indians. Now, when I say they dress up like Indians, this is not well done. They're like still wearing their work boots and pants. They're like smearing dirt on them. They have no idea what the Indians are wearing at the time. They're putting like chicken feathers in their hair. Nobody believes this is actually Native Americans that are going to bombard this ship. But they do bombard the ship. They do take the tea and they dump it into the harbor. This is huge. Millions of dollars of tea gets lost. You can see in this picture here, the whole town sees that this is happening and they show up to watch it. Well, after they get dumped millions of dollars of tea into the ocean, they all like abandon the ship. And the next morning, the redcoats show up. They're supposed to be doing patrols. And they're like, oh my gosh, look what has happened. This is a catastrophe. So these drunk guys that threw it into the port, these are known rabble-rousers. Samuel Adams is clearly probably one of them. Wish we could go into the detail of it in the survey course. Everybody pretty much knows what group of guys would have gone and done this. So the redcoats start looking for them so they can arrest them. But they have to have people tell them who did this. The greatest non-snitching in history. Nobody in the colonies snitches on these guys. Everybody's like, I have no idea who did it. That's shocking. That's crazy. I don't know what happened. Nobody in Boston will tell the redcoats who did this. All right. And this infuriates England because they lost millions of dollars. So England, in response to having this tea thrown in the ocean and then realizing the colonists just aggressively will not give up the culprits, puts a whole bunch of rules on Boston and the colonies as a whole, all right? And they're called the Intolerable Acts. Now, England actually calls these the Coercive Acts, all right, because they're trying to coerce the colonies into doing something. America calls it the Intolerable Acts because these are the rules that get put on the colonies until all that money gets paid back from all this wasted tea. They're closing the port of Boston. They're shutting down any meetings. Any British officials that get arrested for a crime will be tried in Britain. Like when the Boston Massacre happened, those soldiers got tried in the colonies. Now, if that would have happened, they get tried in Britain, which the colonists know basically means they're going to get off scot-free. And basically, the redcoats can do whatever they want in the colonies and they'll never get in trouble. The Intolerable Acts absolutely infuriated the colonists. And it sent tensions pretty much over the edge of the anger towards Britain. Britain not willing to negotiate with the colonists either because now the colonists are vandalizing and throwing out tea and costing them millions of dollars. So the question is, if the colonists enjoyed tea so much, why would they destroy all the tea at the Boston Tea Party? So we talked about that. Pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So it seems like we're jumping multiple years here, and we are. Number one, it's a survey course. Number two, things take a lot longer in the 1700s with communication and organization than it would now with the internet. But in 1775, all right, so Boston Massacre 1770, Boston Tea Party 1773, we're in 1775, and tensions have continued to rise, all right, in the colonies. The committees of correspondence have gotten strong enough that they have actually started organizing militias to stand up to the redcoats. The redcoats are the most powerful military on earth, all right? The British are like, what? Why would they do this? So they realize that these militias are being formed out in these little small towns around Boston. The redcoats clearly don't want that to happen. So in order to have a militia, you have to have weapons. Britain gets inside information that there is a collection of weapons designed to be used by the militia at these two small towns outside of Boston called Lexington and Concord. All right. They would actually get to Concord first, and then they'd get to Lexington. So that a armed rebellion doesn't break out, the redcoats decide they are going to march and confiscate all these weapons by the militia. Hopefully the militia isn't there. They can just take the weapons from this like empty building is what they're hoping, and prevent any type of armed conflict. Because again, the Redcoats are the most powerful military on earth. All right. So what happens is here's a group of Redcoats. They're leaving Boston. They're going to march into Concord, try to confiscate the guns. If they're not there, they're going to go to Lexington, take over those. They expect there to be guns at Concord and Lexington, and that they're going to show up and catch everybody kind of by surprise. They're going to take the guns. There won't even be anybody there to complain about it. So as the Redcoats here are leaving Boston, very famously, this guy Paul Revere is going to take off from Boston, race to Lexington and Concord, and let them know that the Redcoats are coming. The famous thing is he's like, the British are coming, the British are coming. Well, technically at this point, even though there are patriots and loyalists, they're all considered British. So that wouldn't make any sense for him just to say, the British are coming. So he's clearly saying the Redcoats are coming. Paul Revere is also the guy, all right, from yesterday with the Boston Massacre who carved that painting that changed everybody's perspective of the Redcoats as the bad guys. All right. So Paul Revere is an active patriot. He is actively against Britain and the Redcoats. So this is a map. The Redcoats start marching from Boston, and they get up to the first town. All right. And when they get there, all right, at the very first battle at Lexington. They get to Lexington. When they get to Lexington, they realize that there is an armed fight. And here's some colonists. They open fire at the Redcoats because they had been warned by Paul Revere. They open fire. The Redcoats' most powerful army on earth. They open like one volley. They kill a couple people, probably depicted by this painting. I was unaware of that, but this painting looks like some people went down. And they're going to scamper away. All the colonists are going to scamper away. The Redcoats are going to go check for the weapons. The weapons are gone. The militia had gone and cleaned it out. So now the Redcoats are like, all right, we're moving from Lexington now. We are now going to Concord. When so again, they're moving from Lexington, they get to Concord. When the Redcoats march to Concord, again, to confiscate these weapons, Concord is not deserted. The colonists have actually set up an entire line here to defend themselves and defend Concord, all right, from the British coming and taking the weapons, because they all have the weapons in their hands now. These are called Minutemen. So the militia was made up of local people. And if you were part of the militia, you were called a Minuteman. Meaning you had 1 minute's notice. When you hear that the Redcoats are showing up, you have 1 minute to get your weapon and be where you need to be to defend it. All right. So Minutemen existed in their own town and had 1 minute to defend their own town. And that's important here in a second when we talk about the Continental Army. But all the Minutemen here at Concord go and hunker down. The Redcoats show up. They need to take the guns. Not surprisingly, a battle breaks out. It's really about a handful of volleys of firing, reloading, firing again from both sides. A handful of people get killed on the colonial side, and a handful of Redcoats get killed as well at Lexington. Now, the Redcoats absolutely could go in here, storm this, and wipe out every colonist. It is, again, the Redcoats are the most powerful military on earth. However, the entire reason they wanted to go get these weapons is to not have an armed insurrection on their hands. And the commanding officer says, you know what? We're not escalating this. We're not going to be the one that starts a war here. They're willing to fight. Let's just go regroup and figure out what we want to do. So the Redcoats turn around and go back to Boston. The Redcoats 100% could have killed every single colonist there at the time. They chose not to because they were actively trying not to escalate this into an armed conflict, which it clearly already looks like it has. But when the Redcoats turn around and leave, and the colonists are left there at Concord with their guns, it sends this message in the minds of the colonists that they can go toe-to-toe with the Redcoats and defeat them. Even though the colonists or the Redcoats pretty much decided not to fight, that is not the lasting image that is in the minds of the colonists. So when the redcoats turn around and go back, this is famously referred to in history as the shot heard round the world. The reason it's considered the shot that's heard around the world is because it gives the colonists belief that they can stand up to the redcoats. Spoiler alert, eventually it's going to lead to America's independence. The other colonies around the world, after America gains their independence from England, will then slowly start declaring their independence and have their own histories of trying to become independent from England as well. And it really goes back to Lexington and Concord, the first time the colonists stood up to the redcoats, opened fire, armed battle, and the redcoats did not win. All right? Because again, they were trying to be the adults, but in the mind of the colonists at the time, it looks like that the colonists went toe-to-toe with the most powerful military on earth and defeated them. So the question is, explain why the colonists believed that they would have had success against the redcoats, the most powerful military in the world, after the shot heard around the world. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So something very famous happens in 1775 after this. I mean, obviously, we've got the ball rolling here. There's no going back. England is going to retaliate heavy-handedly. The colonists know this. So they create something called the Second Continental Congress. And a survey course, we don't have time to talk about the First Continental Congress, which basically was just trying to politically deal with the issues with England after the Intolerable Acts. England wouldn't listen to us. The Second Continental Congress is the very famous one in American history. So the same guys got together after trying to talk it out and realizing talking might not be the way forward. We're going to try it one more time. And at the Second Continental Congress, all these forefathers, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, these famous forefathers that we'll talk more about in this course, they do create this thing called the Olive Branch Petition. Olive Branch means peace. And they sent it to King George and said, hey, if you don't want no beef on your hands, here's what you got to do. King George has already refused to listen to the colonists previously. This is going to be no different. So the Second Continental Congress, sure, they send, like, it's kind of an ultimatum. Do these things and you won't catch these hands, pretty much. Again, we're talking trash to the most powerful military on earth. We know that that's going to go over like a ton of bricks. So after the Second Continental Congress writes the Olive Branch Petition and sends it to King George, like, all right, what we really need to do is we need to create the Continental Army. All right. So this is a group at the Second Continental Congress. All these are the founding fathers. Every person in this picture is very detailed of a specific person and very influential in the creation of the United States. This is the Olive Branch Petition we sent to King George to try to prevent a war. But at this point, we're basically like, give us everything that we want or forget you. What happens next is the Second Continental Congress gets this guy, George Washington. George Washington lives in America, all right? He is a wealthy landowner, and he was a high-ranking official, colonel, I believe, in the British military before retiring and coming over to the colonists. 100% is a patriot and is willing to take up arms against Britain, all right? He's the only one that has any like military experience in an actual military. So they create the Continental Army. The Continental Army is like professional soldiers who that's their job. They're going to travel around the country. Minutemen, all right? Minutemen stay in their own town and fight, and when the enemy leaves, they don't fight anymore. The Continental Congress will travel around the country fighting where it needs to be done. And they are paid. They are paid official soldiers like the United States military is today. They are paid soldiers. That's the Continental Army. That is their full-time job, and George Washington is put in charge of them. Now, and this is a picture of the Continental Army at Valley Forge, jumping a little ahead in the story here, and we'll get to that tomorrow. But there's no money to actually pay these guys. So they're supposed to be getting paid, but it's very difficult because there's not like enough supplies or food, and you can see these guys are clearly on the struggle bus as George Washington on his white horse is watching his troops. The Continental Army is a struggle to keep together because while they're supposed to be paid, it was very difficult to actually pay them. The question here is, explain the difference between the soldiers that were to be in the Continental Army and the Minutemen that fought at Lexington and Concord. So explain the difference in those two types of soldiers. Pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right, so 1776, this is the big turning point, all right? This guy named Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet, it's like a little mini book, all right? And it's called Common Sense. He basically disperses this to the entire country. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, says it is common sense for America to be their own country. There's no benefit to being owned by England. And he spells it out very clearly for the majority of Americans that it makes sense to declare your independence. Common Sense, this pamphlet, is extremely influential in American history because remember how I said 60% of Americans didn't care one way or other? Well, after Common Sense came out, the vast majority of that 60% that didn't care then become patriots. So now the majority of the country is a patriot and they want their independence from England. So that has been determined. America is going to declare their independence, and America, the colonists, declare their independence from England with a document called the Declaration of Independence. We basically say, because England has treated us so bad, all men are created equal, like we are tired of being treated less. All right, we have natural laws. We go through this all the Thomas Jefferson writes it. And it's basically saying we are done with you, England. This is treason. All right. The colonies just say we're our own country now. And then they go and have all these people sign it, all these guys that helped write it. The first guy to sign it was John Hancock. His name is always the biggest here on the Declaration of Independence, very famously, because they know this is going to lead to war. If you lose this war, you're a traitor, and you will most likely be executed for treason. So everybody's really nervous at first to sign their name because they know by signing your name, you could be executed if you don't beat the most powerful military on earth. John Hancock's first guy that goes up here and writes his name really big, and he says, I hope King George sees mine, because that was kind of the mentality at the time, like, hey, if we have to die for this cause, we're willing to do it. So the Declaration of Independence, America declares their independence from England. What's crazy, this is a super famous document. Every other thing we'd sent to King George, he tore it up. This is a very famous document that we have on display in Washington, D.C. today. It's the most famous document in American history. Why did King George not tear this one up when we sent it to him? I had to look that up because I didn't know. And here's what makes the story even better. We never sent it to him. We didn't write the Declaration of Independence for England. We wrote it for ourselves. So that we knew as a country, we're done. We're our own independent country. They'll figure it out eventually. The Declaration of Independence is like a breakup letter to England. All right? Because that's literally what it is. We're breaking up with them. Not only is it a breakup letter to England, we ghosted them. We didn't even let them know we broke up with them. But it's very important, right? Because that's what the question is here, is why is it historically significant that America never even sent the Declaration of Independence to England? What does that indicate about the colonist view of Britain? We were done with them. We weren't worried about if they liked it or not. It is such a clear example of a firm, complete break with Britain that we're not going back, we're not working this out. We wrote this breakup letter for us, not for you. We just let the newspapers tell them about it. And that's how King George found out that we had declared our independence, is through the newspaper. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're done for the day. See you guys tomorrow.